Well, I want to welcome everybody to a very important and timely discussion on COVID-19 and holding China accountable for their misdeeds in really unleashing a worldwide pandemic that we're all dealing with, and what the federal and what the state responses are. We're pleased to have, and I'm personally very happy to have a friend, Senator Cruz, on with us to talk about what he's doing, what we're doing here in Missouri. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Senator Cruz to give some introductory remarks.
Well, Eric, it is great to be with you. Thank you for your leadership in Missouri and nationally, and thank you to everyone who's participating in this discussion. This is an enormously challenging time as we deal with a global pandemic and as we deal simultaneously with an economic crisis. And I think the most significant national security and foreign policy consequence of this pandemic is going to be a fundamental reevaluation of the United States' relationship with China. China bears a very direct and real responsibility for this global pandemic. And for a long time, I have been advocating that China poses the most significant geopolitical threat to the United States for the next century. And what we've seen as a result of this pandemic is an awful lot of voices that had been skeptical, both in the media and in Washington and worldwide, are becoming much more clear-eyed as to the profound danger that the Chinese Communist Party and their ambitions of global domination and their willingness to lie and cheat and cover up, all of that danger, I think, is becoming more and more clear to a lot of people.
Yeah, and I want to thank Senator Cruz for his leadership. I think he's been a strong voice on this issue for a very long time. And as he mentioned, I think a lot of the issues are coming into focus now, the broader issues, even beyond what we're dealing with right now with COVID-19 and the challenges that the United States has in dealing with China long term. I thought what I might do, take a step back and thank everybody for being a part of this important broadcast. As Attorney General of Missouri, we're very focused on the rule of law, and that plays out in a number of different ways. We launched a Safer Streets initiative last year, which was an unprecedented cooperation with the U.S. Attorney's Office, both in the St. Louis area and the Kansas City area, to crack down on violent crime. So we have lawyers in our office actually deputized as assistant U.S. attorneys. So we're prosecuting violent crime in federal court and doing everything we can at the statewide level to support law enforcement and the important work that they do. We've also been very active in taking on the administrative state in a broad sense, really counterintuitive what the founders viewed as the beautiful system of checks and balances, the horizontal dispersion of government, ultimately to protect people's liberty. I mean, government is our shared project to protect people's rights ultimately, and taking on the abuse and overreach of the administrative state's been a focus of ours. But I think, as Senator Cruz mentioned, leadership demands that we respond to challenges as they arise. And so as we learned more as an office, me personally, the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party's role in the malfeasance here as this worldwide pandemic was unleashed. I mean, they have engaged in a campaign of lies and deceit and deception from the jump. And we're talking about in December, when they became aware of human-to-human transmission, into January, destroying evidence, not allowing members from the CDC to enter the country for any kind of an inspection, silencing whistleblowers. Citizen journalists have gone missing. We know that the doctor who came forward in late December and sent out the warning signal to the world really was silenced and forced to recant in early January. And it wasn't really until late January that the world became aware of the impact as this virus has been unleashed on the world. And no corner of the globe has been spared. Here in Missouri, we have thousands and thousands of Missourians who've lost their jobs, hundreds of Missourians who've lost their lives. Families are separated from family members, whether it's in nursing homes, not being able to attend funerals. And so as the Attorney General, I felt a moral obligation to bring this case forward for the people that look to me as the chief legal officer of our state to hold the Chinese government accountable And so this is a really important cause. And I think my approach here has been sort of all of the above. And we sent a letter along with other attorneys general across the country to Congress earlier this week, asking them for a congressional investigation. I know Senator Cruz has been on the front lines of this too, and can speak more to this of what's happening at the federal level. But I think as a country, certainly as this, as a state, this blame needs to be placed squarely at the feet of who it belongs to, and that's the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. And we can talk a little bit more about the specific aspects of that lawsuit. But I think this growing chorus now of holding the Chinese government accountable is really important, because that's where the blame lies.
Look, I think that is exactly right. And let me say, Eric, thank you for your leadership and Missouri's leadership in bringing this lawsuit, because holding China accountable is critically important. And there are a number of different elements to doing so. The first element is simply getting a clear accounting of what China did and what their specific responsibility was. And that's true, I think, on multiple levels. First of all, the origin of the virus. Now, we don't know for a fact the precise origin of the virus. We know that it is a coronavirus, that it appears to be, it is 96% similar to a coronavirus that was found in a species of bat, a horseshoe bat, that is in China. We also know that there are not one, but two Chinese laboratories owned and controlled by the Chinese government in Wuhan that were not only studying coronaviruses, but were studying coronaviruses derived from bats. So the specific type of coronavirus that has caused this pandemic. We also know that the bat that has a 96% similar virus, the closest it occurs naturally in China to Wuhan is 1,000 miles away in caves, 1,000 miles away. The two labs were studying those bats from those caves 1,000 miles away. We're studying the coronavirus, and we also know that they had exceptionally shoddy security measures. That they were not effective in protecting and securing the dangerous viruses they were studying. We know this, among other reasons, because the US State Department had two separate wires, both before this pandemic occurred, that raised very serious concerns about the security protocols in place in these laboratories, and raised the risk that if they didn't improve their security protocols, it could lead to a global pandemic of coronavirus. That was the State Department before this happened, raising these concerns. We also know one of those two labs, by the way, is literally 300 yards from the wet market where the first outbreak occurred. 300 yards. You could hit a golf ball from that lab to the wet market. It'd take a good drive, but you could do it. That's how close it is. We also know that once the outbreak escalated, the Chinese government demanded of these labs that they destroy their samples, that they go in and destroy the evidence. Now, you and I have both spent a lot of years in law enforcement. If a defendant destroys evidence, a court will naturally draw an inference from that that evidence was incriminating, that you're destroying the evidence for a reason. You're trying to hide something by destroying that evidence. That's what China did. The weight of the circumstantial evidence, and it's all circumstantial, is that they were studying this virus at one or both of these labs, and that it escaped accidentally, that either a human or an animal got infected accidentally because their security measures were shoddy, and then ended up infecting other humans or other animals at the wet market or elsewhere, and that's how it spread. We don't know that for a fact because China won't let us go in and investigate. We need to answer those questions, starting with a very simple question. Were the labs studying the novel coronavirus that is this particular virus? By the way you would ordinarily go and examine that is you'd look at the samples in the labs, which the Chinese government has destroyed. or you'd go to the wet market and look at the animals there. But the Chinese government, after this outbreak occurred, went in with bleach and wiped everything down in the wet market. They kept no samples. They did no examination. So you can't trace what animals did this originate from. Had they come from the lab, you can't trace any of that because they bleached and destroyed all the evidence. That's piece number one, the origins of the virus. And by the way, some media fact checkers like to say, well, no. It's clear the virus wasn't manufactured in a lab. Now, you and I have been in enough courtrooms to know that when someone answers a question different than the one you asked, that's a big reveal. It's a big tell. I'm not suggesting that the virus was manufactured in a lab. I don't have any evidence to suggest that, and I have no reason to doubt the doctors and experts who say it appears to be a naturally occurring virus. What the evidence suggests instead is this was a naturally occurring virus that came from bats, that they were studying at the lab, and that they were shoddy in their security measures and accidentally let it escape. That needs clear accountability and investigation. The second piece of it, and Eric, you talked about this at good length, we know beyond a doubt that there was a massive government cover-up on the next stage, that after the virus escaped. We know the Chinese government actively lied, suppressed, covered it up. You go back to mid-December when a handful of Chinese physicians, really heroic whistleblowers, stood up and tried to say, well, hold on a second, there's a SARS-like virus. It seems to be transmitting human to human. It's really dangerous. And what does the Chinese government do? It goes and arrests them. It puts them in jail. It charges them criminally. It says, pointing out that we have an infectious disease, that disturbs the public order. It makes them sign statements recounting their previous statements. And as you noted, many of these whistleblowers have now disappeared. That we don't know where they are. Are they in a Chinese concentration camp? Are they in jail? Have they been killed? We don't know. They're simply missing and have been missing for a couple of months. China actively lied about it. While it was doing this, it was allowing thousands and thousands of people to leave Wuhan and go all over the world, go to Italy, go to Iran, go all over the world, celebrate the Lunar New Year. At the exact same time that China was doing that, it was hoarding medical equipment. It began hoarding ventilators. It began hoarding PPE, masks and gloves, buying many more of them on the world stage and stopping selling them. It was doing all of this surreptitiously, building up its supplies, because apparently what that suggests is that it knew a pandemic was coming, but doing nothing to stop people from Wuhan spreading the disease all over the world. And that cover-up, which extended in January, China wrongfully said there's no human-to-human transmission. The WHO, the World Health Organization, like a puppet, parroted what the Chinese Communist government said, there's no human-to-human transmission. That was false, that was a lie, that was contrary to the evidence. And as a result of their cover-up, in a very real sense, China bears direct responsibility for the 300,000 lives that have been lost worldwide, and for the trillions of dollars of economic devastation that have come from this pandemic.
Well, and Senator Cruz, just to amplify a couple of those points before we move on to a few questions, they were well aware of the human-to-human transmission as early as December, and they as early as December 5th, as we note in our 47-page complaint. And I would encourage folks watching this to take a look at our 47-page complaint, which has been filed in federal court in the Eastern District of Missouri. It lays out in one document, maybe the first time that has happened, many of the allegations that Senator Cruz notes about the origins and the cover-up. And by the way, that cover-up continues to this day. We still aren't getting good answers that could help the world community deal with this coronavirus and the impact, but well aware of the human-to-human transmission, flights going around the world, that Lunar New Year celebration that Senator Cruz mentioned in Wuhan had 40,000 people in it. And if you think about that, just complete disregard, not just for what's happened across the world, but their own people, and prioritizing this cover up and saving whatever face or whatever the intention was at the time. It certainly wasn't prioritizing human life. And that virus is now spread across the world, and the impact has been deep and severe at a human level, at an economic level. I mean, to put this in perspective, over 30 million jobs have been lost in 60 days in our country. It's unprecedented. And so in that petition, we allege just for the state of Missouri alone, up to $44 billion worth of damages. And so I think that we certainly probably won't be the last state to move forward. We just happen to be the first. But I think that Senator Cruz's leadership and people understanding the facts, and those are laid out in the complaint in great detail about what they knew and when they knew. And these are all published open reports that substantiate our allegations in that complaint. But it's very clear they were well aware of human-to-human transmission. From the highest levels, ordered these labs to destroy evidence, silence people who were heroically trying to sound the alarm, and we're dealing with what we're dealing with right now. So we have a few questions here, and I will read them off. And the first one I think is for me. General Schmidt, what exceptions within the FSIA allow states to sue China? It's a very important question and central to our lawsuit. Typically, sovereign nations can enjoy broad protections, but under the FSIA, there are exceptions to that immunity that is granted. One of which that we focus on squarely in our lawsuit is the commercial activity exception. So if a country is engaged in objectively commercial activities, and there's a really interesting Scalia opinion from the 1980s that deals with this issue on point, that if they're objectively engaged in commercial activity, they no longer avail themselves to those protections. And we allege that by moving forward with the hoarding of PPE in a really critical time where this outbreak really could have been prevented or contained, really, engage in the hoarding of the PPE. And China went from a net exporter to a net importer of PPE, all the while the world is left in the dark. And you could even, there's evidence of junk PPE being sent out when the world needed it most, but certainly that is objectively commercial activity. The running of these labs is commercial activity. The hospital system that the Chinese government is running is objectively commercial activity. And we don't stop there. We also allege non-state actors played a role in this, principally the Chinese Communist Party. So we believe very strongly that our claims will survive a challenge if and when the Chinese government answers the complaint because of those exceptions under the FSIA. So the second question is for Senator Cruz. Senator Cruz, you recently vowed to hold Chinese officials involved in the COVID-19 cover-up accountable. What do you think is the best course of action to do so?
Well, I think we need to be pursuing multiple paths. I think one of the paths is the litigation that Missouri is leading, and as I said, thank you for doing that. Another path, I've introduced a whole host, about a dozen different pieces of legislation focused on different aspects of stopping the Chinese threat. One in particular focuses on the cover-up, the coronavirus cover-up. Now, we've long viewed censorship as a human rights violation, and that's something that we've been engaged in trying to combat Chinese censorship. But we now are seeing that censorship, when it comes to health information, is also a public health and a national security issue as well. That the Chinese censorship had far broader consequences than simply silencing the free speech of Chinese citizens, that it endangered the lives of people all over the planet. And so I've introduced legislation that imposes economic sanctions and harsh sanctions on any Chinese officials who ordered or participated in the censorship of the medical information concerning coronavirus, and really targeted at those who were part of silencing this process. I think that's one of the tools that we can and should use, along with pushing for a direct and clear accounting of exactly what it is that China did.
Okay, the next question, I think, Senator, is for both of us. Why are efforts to hold China accountable coming from local AGs at the state level and not from the administration? I touched on this earlier. My view on this is that we all have a role to play. And I think that it's an all the above approach, at least for me. I think that the state AGs can play a role, certainly with our litigation. Ultimately, the goal is getting to the truth, and through that discovery process, really uncover a lot of new information and certainly verify what we already know. And for me, my perspective, the more and more we learn about this, the more I think devastating the indictment is on the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. The impact it's had on their own people and certainly across the world, the denying or the hiding of the origin and the cover up as this thing was unleashed. And so I think that there's more to come here. Certainly, I think Congress has a role to play with leaders like Senator Cruz, and that all can work hand in hand. I mean, I think the answers we get, whether it's from our lawsuit or through a congressional investigation, all of those, I think, continue to build the case of why the Chinese government should be held accountable for this.
No, I think that's right. And a phrase you use that I very much agree with is all of the above. I think we ought to be pressing. China is the greatest geopolitical threat facing America right now today. And we ought to be using every lever of power, every organ of government to combat that threat and to force accountability for China's responsibility for this horrific pandemic. I think state attorneys general often are the point of the spear. State AGs can be quick and nimble and aggressive, and we've seen them drive legal challenges, some good, some bad, but be aggressively out there at the front of the charge. I think the administration is very much focused on these issues, and I've had multiple conversations with President Trump, with senior officials in the administration. And look, obviously the administration's first priority right now it is defeating this crisis, defeating the pandemic. And so from the public health perspective, focusing on testing, focusing on PPE, focusing on social distancing, focusing on developing treatments, developing vaccines, developing a cure. That has been an all of government major focus of the administration. A second major focus of the administration has been responding to the economic catastrophe that we've seen. You've mentioned 36 million Americans unemployed in the last 2 months. That's 20% of our national workforce out of work. Millions of small businesses on the verge of bankruptcy. We are seeing numbers, these are the worst economic numbers since the Great Depression. And this was caused, normally when there's an economic downturn, there's some problem in the economy that it's responding to. That's not what happened here. 3 months ago, the economy was booming. We had record low unemployment. We were seeing prosperity. We were seeing that low taxes and low regulations produced tremendous economic results. But then we got this pandemic from China, and the economic slowdown we're seeing is the direct result of steps government has taken to fight that pandemic. And so the president, the administration, I'm on the task force advising the president on how to reopen the economy. I think we need to lean in vigorously, letting people go back to work, letting people provide for their families, but doing so in a way that's safe, that relies on sound science, that protects the most vulnerable, those who are very elderly, those who have serious health conditions, that continues to keep them in protective isolation, but that lets young, healthy people, where the numbers and data support it, go back to work and drive the economy. Those priorities are consuming much of the administration's time right now. But I have every confidence that particularly as we come out of the urgency of the crisis, that the next stage will naturally turn to, okay, who's responsible for what we just endured? And how do we get clear, credible, objective answers? And how do we hold China accountable? And those conversations, I know the president wants to do so. I've had multiple conversations with him about that. I am leading the fight in the Senate to do so. And I fully expect that we will see the federal government and the states working hand in hand in that regard.
I think we've got time for one more question and about 3 minutes left. So Senator Cruz, I'll let you kick this one off and then I'll wrap it up. As Congress and the states seek to address China's involvement in COVID-19, how will legislation and lawsuits affect the relationship between China and the United States?
Well, I think the relationship between China and the United States will be fundamentally changing, and it should change. I have been urging for it to change. You know, in October, I took a tour of Asia. I went to Pearl Harbor and Japan and Taiwan and India and Hong Kong. And that was designed to really be a friends and allies tour of a meeting with our major friends and allies, all surrounding China. The entire purpose and topic of the discussion was standing up to growing Chinese aggression, Chinese military aggression, economic aggression, diplomatic aggression, Chinese espionage, Chinese intellectual property theft, the growing specter all across the region and across the world. And I think that is profoundly important. In Hong Kong, I met with the protesters there 2 million people in the streets standing up against Chinese oppression. In fact, I did a Sunday show interview dressed in all black in solidarity with the protesters because they dress in black. I think what we're seeing now post-pandemic is a lot of the people who had poo-pooed, who had diminished the threat of China, are realizing the threat is exactly what we had been saying it was. And one area in particular that I think we're going to see real need for legislation, and I expect both legislative action and executive action on this front, which is decoupling our economy from China and in particular critical infrastructure. We are far too dependent on China for vital critical infrastructure, for medical equipment, for PPE, for pharmaceuticals. They systematically, the Chinese Communist government, systematically targeted critical infrastructure, drove out of business American producers, drew it into China. And in the midst of this pandemic, so they're producing a vast percentage of our critical medicines. They're producing antibiotics and blood pressure medicines and heart medicines and Alzheimer's medication and cancer medication and antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication. And a Chinese state-run newspaper in the middle of this pandemic suggested that they cut off pharmaceuticals to the United States as a tool of economic warfare during this pandemic. Well, you know, Eric, that wouldn't just be economic warfare. That would be real warfare. That would be quite literally threatening the lives of millions of Americans who depend upon those medicines. And so I believe we need to make it a national priority to onshore that production, to bring that production back to the United States, because it is lunacy to let millions of Americans' lives depend upon the good graces of the Chinese Communist government. And I think that's going to be a discussion that is going to entail not just days and weeks, but months and years, how to decouple our economy and ensure that we are protecting national security and critical infrastructure here at home in America.
I agree. And I think that in wrapping this up, I think rightfully so, a lot of our discussions at this point have been focused on trade, and I think that needs to continue. But I think this is an opportunity, I think, for us in this country and across the world to kind of reset that conversation. There's much bigger, broader, deeper discussions to have about how we view the world and what we value. And we've seen, sadly and tragically, a very authoritarian regime, the worst of it in this instance, where millions of lives have been damaged and wrecked because of the cover-up and the devaluing of human life in that country. And I think that these discussions are going to continue and are very important. They are not limited to this crisis, although we certainly are dealing with that right now. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank Senator Cruz for his leadership in a really thoughtful discussion. And there's more to do and there's more to come, but we thank everybody for joining us. So stay healthy and stay safe.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you.